Hello and welcome. In 1958, Leyland launched the Leyland Atlantean, and it really can't be understated on how much of a game changer this was when it turned up. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about Leyland Atlanteans because over the last few videos and the last few months, we've had quite a lot of Leyland Atlanteans pop up on the channel, and I don't want to overkill it. Because as much as I love Leyland Atlanteans, there are other wonderful and beautiful buses to look at, isn't there? Now, again, as we saw in a previous video, Ribble were pretty hot to trot off the mark to order some Leyland Atlantean coaches. And these, of course, would be the Gay Hostess coaches, and would feature such luxuries as reclining seats, a toilet, and a hostess service. Now, despite all this, they were just basically Leyland Atlanteans on the outside, with a little bit more chrome trim and a snazzy paint job. And no matter how much you like the Gay Hostesses, and trust me I do, you can't really deny that parked next to a typical single-decker coach of the period, they looked a little bit boxy. Ribble bought these Gay Hostesses for its Standerwick subsidiary for long-distance coaching work. However, they were mostly used on the Lancashire to London express services. These were followed by similar but slightly less luxurious White Lady Leyland Atlanteans, which was intended to be used on long-distance express runs within the operating area of Ribble. Now, I will try and remember to put a link to the video for the Gay Hostesses up in the top right-hand corner for you to watch after you've seen this one. Around this time, Bristol Commercial Vehicles were pumping out the Bristol F-type low-decker in vast quantities still. There was the FS, which was the rear entrance flat floor version. There was the FL, which was the much rarer long wheelbase version of the rear entrance model with the flat floor. There was the FSF, which was the flat floor model with the front entrance and a short wheelbase. And then there was the most successful of all, the FLF, which was the front entrance long wheelbase flat floor variant. Now, again, I've done a video on the Bristol low decker previously, and I will put a little link to that up in the top right hand corner. But you'll have to forgive me because it's one of my older videos and it's not got the same editing style as my later videos, so it's a little bit clunky. It's a bit like comparing a Betamax with a DVD player. Now, it could be argued that Bristol Commercial Vehicles was a little bit behind the game when it came to rear-engined double-decker buses. They'd recently had some engineering marvels, the Bristol low decker obviously being one of them, but also the Bristol RE, their single-decker rear-engine bus and coach chassis. With the advent of the Leyland Atlantean in 1958 and then the Daimler Fleetline in 1960, it seemed natural that Bristol would be the next company to produce a rear-engine double-decker bus. However, Bristol being Bristol didn't think within the normal context of the box, and maybe they were still riding a little bit high on the success of the low decker and the RE. Work on the project for the new bus for Bristol Commercial Vehicles started in 1964, and this originally was to be called the Bristol N-type, which was picking up the next vacant letter from the old alphabetic sequence that Bristol had used for its chassis from 1925 all the way up to 1948 with the introduction of the low decker. Construction of the first prototype chassis started in 1965, and this was an 11 metre 36 foot long chassis. Whereas both Leyland and Daimler had gone for a transverse engine, that is an engine that sits across the back of the chassis from left to right, Bristol had decided to go for something totally different. The new chassis was to have a longitudinal engine situated in the offside rear corner. This meant basically it was an inline engine pointing towards the front of the vehicle, and the drive could come out the back of the engine into the gearbox and technically straight into the rear axle. Now, that's a very layman's term description, but that's basically what it did. There would be no complicated transfer boxes or U-drives as there were on the Atlantean and the Fleetline. When you think about it, with the engine at the rear of the chassis, the drive has to come out and then turn 90 degrees into the gearbox and then 90 degrees back out of the gearbox into a transfer box where it turns 90 degrees the other way into the rear axle. And that is an awful lot of kerfuffle, but more importantly, it's an awful lot of things that can go wrong. And more often or not, they did. So with Bristol thinking outside the box, they decided to actually simplify that final drive to the rear axle. And the even more clever thing is, with the engine tucked away in the offside rear corner, it would leave space in the rear overhang for another set of doors. Now originally the Bristol N-Type was designed to be bodied as a bus, a coach, or indeed a double-decker bus. And again, the layout with the doors at the rear would allow something along the lines of the Continental buses that we now see all the time operating over in Europe, where you have a conventional set of doors at the front next to the driver, maybe a second set of doors in the middle, and then lastly, a third set of doors behind the rear axle. At a stroke, Bristol had designed something that was way ahead of its time, to be honest. When you think of buses like the new Routemaster for London, for example, there's an awful lot in common with the Bristol N-Type. Now, the only thing that really dates it is the choice of engine. Originally, the Bristol N-Type would be offered with the Gardner 6LX, the Gardner 6LW, or the Leyland 0600. And these are big engines and they take up a lot of room, and more importantly, they're very heavy. So you can imagine having all that weight in the offside rear corner on the rear overhang bouncing around. It was kind of a modern design but with 1960s thinking. It was a little bit like Thunderbirds, where you had spaceships and space rockets, but they were driven by analog controls, big red levers and Cadillac-sized steering wheels. The Gardner engine at the time was one of the top engines that bus operators wanted. And of course, Leyland had taken a share in Bristol Commercial Vehicles fairly recently, and this resulted in Bristol having access to Leyland engines, which increased appeal across all the operators. Also, with the engine at the rear, it meant that the rear overhang couldn't be reduced any further, and this would result in the minimum length being offered of 32 foot 9 inches as governed by the regulations on vehicles at that time. But before all these details were announced to the public, Bristol decided to change the name of the chassis from Bristol N-Type to the Bristol VR, VR standing for vertical rear. This obviously relating to the position of the engine. And it was announced that the chassis would be available in two lengths, 33 foot and 36 foot. Two bus-bodied prototypes were produced and both were bodied by Eastern Coachworks. The first one carried the chassis number VRX 001 and this became GGM 431D, whilst VRX 002 became HHW 933D. Both of these were exhibited at the Commercial Motor Show at Earls Court in September 1966, with HHW 933D forming part of Bristol Commercial Vehicles display, whilst GGM 431D was displayed on Eastern Coachworks stand. Now, incidentally, this was the first time that both Bristol and Eastern Coachworks had attended this motor show since 1948. This being due to the sales restrictions imposed on them being state-owned. Now, Bristol had intended to release a transverse version of the VR, but this was to be an option in addition to the VRL. The transverse model would be the Bristol VRT that we would all come to know and potentially love. And this is where things go a little bit wrong for Bristol, because in 1968 the British government announced a bus grant. This was intended to modernise British bus fleets and speed up the introduction of one-man operated buses. With the grant, bus operators could claim back a percentage of the cost of a new double-decker or single-decker bus. However, these vehicles would have to meet certain requirements, and for double-decker buses, this requirement would be that they were fitted with a transverse engine rather than a longitudinal one. Now, this obviously was the kiss of death to the Bristol VR when it came to double-decker buses. Now, is it just me that thinks that Bristol Commercial Vehicles was stitched up when it came to the bus grant? You'd have thought somewhere along the line somebody in government would have turned round to Bristol Commercial Vehicles and said, do you know what, you might want to rethink that idea and put the engine across the back instead of having it in line. Or maybe they would have taken a rethink and said, hey, do you know what? This is a very well respected chassis builder and engineering company. Look what they've built. Maybe we should include this in the new bus grant. Now, I'm not going to get all political, but this is the problem when non-bus people try and govern the bus industry, isn't it? In those days, it was politicians. These days, it's accountants. This would really leave only two options available for the Bristol VRL, and those options being either as an export model or being used as a coach. Now, despite all this with the bus grant and the introduction of the Bristol VRT, Bristol continued to persevere with the VRL design, but it probably didn't get as much attention as it needed to. And my reasoning for that comment will become very clear very soon. The first production Bristol VRL went as an export to South Africa, and this was to become the first of 14 buses for Johannesburg. This was followed by 11 further buses for Pretoria, also in South Africa. However, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because the second production Bristol VRL chassis was for a British customer. And this is where our story really starts. Earlier on, I mentioned the Gay Hostess Leyland Atlantean coaches, and by this time they were starting to get a little bit long in the tooth, not in age-wise, but in mileage-wise. These coaches were clocking up astronomical mileage between the northwest of England and London, and Ribble was now looking seriously at replacing them with something equally as impressive. Now, the standard length of a single-decker coach had been increased in 1962. The Gay Hostesses seated 50 passengers, which you could now easily accommodate in a conventional single-decker coach. Although, of course, without the same comfort and luxury as the Gay Hostesses. What would be needed was a longer wheelbase double-decker vehicle. So in September 1968, when this second production Bristol VRL appeared, it was bodied by Eastern Coachworks to a high-specification coach for Ribble's subsidiary Standerwick. Registered FCK 450G, it was given the fleet number 50S. And this vehicle seated 60 passengers, together with an enormous luggage space and onboard toilet facilities, as was with the Gay Hostess coach. It was designed for cruising on the motorway of speeds up to 70 miles an hour between the northwest and London, and it appeared at the Earls Court Motor Show in September 1968 on Eastern Coachworks stand, where, quite rightly so, it was one of the outstanding exhibits of that year's show. Again, this was a very futuristic designed vehicle, and it compares very favourably to the double-deck coaches of today, things like the Neoplan Skyliners and even the MCW Metroliner. Okay, not coaches of today, but still current when you look at the design for the Bristol VRL. The bodywork was designed with two doors. The one opposite the driver in the conventional position was a hinged door rather than an electric door as we'd normally expect, and this was more used as a crew door or an emergency exit. The main passenger doors were the ones in the middle, and to the rear of those was the staircase leading to the upper deck. Next to the stairs was the toilet compartment, and beside this was a full-size door that allowed access into the rear luggage compartment of the coach. As I mentioned before, these were 60-seaters. There were 42 top-deck passengers and 18 downstairs. These passengers on the top deck were kept cool with forced air ventilation and opening roof lights, whilst those downstairs had supplementary sliding windows. These coaches would be powered by the larger Leyland 0680 engines, which developed at 175 brake horsepower at 2000 RPM. This drove through a 5-speed epicyclic transmission, and the vehicle was fitted with power-assisted steering. FCK 450G was extensively tested by Ribble and Standerwick prior to its maiden run from Blackpool to London in December 1968. It was reported that the performance of this coach was little less than breathtaking, with very little engine noise audible in either of the saloons. They gave a very smooth ride as well, and could achieve speeds as high as 70 miles an hour, as I mentioned previously. Now you have to remember this was in a time when many family cars struggled to get up to 70 miles an hour, so driving along the M1 in a Morris Minor suddenly being overtaken by this Leviathan on wheels must have been absolutely awe-inspiring. Ribble was so impressed with the results from the testing and the operation of this coach that they decided to order 11 similar specification coaches. Now there were a few minor detail differences between those and the prototype coach. The engine cooling grills were enlarged. The fuel tanks and the filler neck on the near side were repositioned, and Eastern Coachworks also revised the bodywork, and this resulted in the removal of the frosted glass window in the rear luggage compartment door, whilst the offside emergency exit was moved forward to a position behind the front axle, which unfortunately messed up the lower deck window pillar spacing. These impressive coaches started entering service from November 1970, and these were given the fleet numbers 51 to 61 and the registration numbers LRN 51 to LRN 61J. This first batch were delivered in the attractive Standerwick maroon and cream livery. To keep up the replacements with the Gay Hostess coaches, Ribble ordered an additional 18 VRL double-deck coaches during the summer of 1970. 10 arrived in 1971, with the final 8 scheduled for the 1972 delivery. All of these were similar in appearance to the first batch, except for the last 2 vehicles, which were built in the summer of 1972. Now, by now, the National Bus Company had introduced its standard coach livery of white, and these last 2 coaches reflected that change. The penultimate coach, number 78, was finished in white, but had light blue window surrounds, whilst the last one, number 79, was delivered in all-over national white. The first part of the second batch was registered OCK 62K to OCK 71K, and were given the fleet numbers 62 to 71. The last batch, which included the 2 national white coaches, was PRN 72K to PRN 79K, carrying the fleet numbers 72 to 79. The 30 Standerwick Bristol VRL coaches established themselves on express services between London and the North West, but despite a number of modifications, they did gain a bit of a reputation for being prone to differential and gearbox failures, and thus they gained the reputation, unfortunately, of being rather troublesome, unlike their predecessors, the Gay Hostess Leyland Atlanteans. And I think it's a shame that Bristol didn't develop this concept a lot more, because I think if they'd have ironed out a lot of the faults and the kinks in the design, they could have ended up with something really special and really reliable. However, sadly, the demise of the Bristol VRLs on the motorway expresses was not down to any mechanical fault or mechanical issue. In the early hours of the 26th of July 1974, one of these fine coaches was speeding south on the M1 motorway near Luton. The driver was overtaking a long line of lorries when suddenly he saw a lamp standard across the lane in front of him, which was the result of a lorry having jackknifed moments before. The driver swerved the large coach to try and avoid a collision, but after several skids, the coach eventually toppled over onto its side, this sadly resulting in the death of 3 passengers, with 39 passengers being injured, some of those seriously. The accident was extensively covered in the press, which resulted in questions being asked in Parliament with regards to the safety of double-decker coaches on Britain's motorways. Now, because politicians like to jump on bandwagons, this led to some of the senior politicians calling for a total ban on double-decker coaches on motorways. Now, this ban never actually happened, but it gave National Travel North West, who'd taken over responsibility for operating the coaches, cold feet, and they decided to withdraw the coaches between 1975 and 1976. However, the last ones weren't withdrawn until 1977. Now, interestingly, some of the Bristol VRLs were actually moved down to National Travel South East, where it was planned to run them on a high-density commuter service into London from Essex. However, this was not to be, and the vehicles weren't used. But had they been used, this would have been the forerunner of the commuter services that operated in the 1980s, with long wheelbase coach-seated Leyland Olympians. The Bristol VRLs were replaced by conventional Leyland Leopard coaches, and upon their withdrawal it left the national travel fleet completely single deck, bar one AEC Regent with National Travel South East. Now there were no shortage of eager buyers for these Bristol VRL coaches, as they were withdrawn rather early on in their careers and were still fairly fresh-faced. The first vehicle sold was the pioneer of the batch, FCK 450G, and this was sold to Coastal Coaches of Newhaven. Tyne and Wear bought 6 Bristol VRLs for use between Newcastle Central Station and the Tyne Commission Quay, where no doubt that massive luggage compartment at the back became extremely useful. They also found their way onto sightseeing work in London, where they predated the craze several decades later for double-decker coaches being converted to open-top buses. Many of the VRLs operated with smaller independent fleets, where they became flagship vehicles on account of their size and specification. Among these smaller companies was one Stagecoach of Perth, who grew into the company that you know and love today. Another familiar name associated with the Bristol VRLs was the holiday operator Thomas Cook. The ex-Standerwick Bristol VRLs were even exported, with some going to Australia and the United States. However, within a matter of around 5 years, National changed their policy on double-deck coaches, and a new generation of Metroliners and Neoplans took to the road. And it can be certainly argued that these coaches paved the way for these developments in coach travel, with Standerwick and indeed Ribble laying the foundations down for what we now regard as the rapid coach service. There's reportedly a handful of surviving Bristol VRLs dotted around the globe, even today. The best known of these is preserved LRN 60J, which is with Ribble Vehicle Preservation Trust and is immaculately restored. In fact, it's fair to say that this coach is probably better now than it was when it was in service. There has been a colossal amount of money and time spent on this vehicle, and it really does show. It's an absolute credit to the Ribble Preservation Trust, it really is. The other well-known Standerwick survivor is OCK 66K, which pops up every so often here on YouTube. This coach was latterly with Endeavour Coach Company in Australia. I'm not sure if it's still with them or not, but apparently it's now been altered to a Bristol VRT configuration, the engine being moved to being transverse across the rear of the chassis, and this was done using Leyland Atlantean parts. I would love to look under the bonnet on that and see what it looks like, wouldn't you? There's also allegedly a couple loitering in Minnesota in America, but these were last reported in 2006 and 2010, so again I'm not sure if they're actually still currently with us or not. LRN 55J was supposedly meant to be surviving in Toulouse in France, but again this was last reported way back in June 2005, and a lot can happen in that time, can't it? But the reality is that somewhere out there in the world, in a field, abandoned and forgotten by everybody, there could be one of these Standerwick Bristol VRLs hanging on by a thread, waiting for a saviour to come along and rescue it. Although, of course, you would need incredibly deep pockets, and that's just bringing it back to this country. More than likely, they're mechanically expired with failed gearboxes or failed final drives. And that's still assuming that the two that allegedly survive in America, if they do, have retained their original mechanical units. Americans are very keen on swapping the English engines over in double-decker buses that they import from the UK with mechanical units that they're more familiar with, those such as Cummins or Caterpillar. I do hope you enjoyed this episode on these rather special coaches. Don't forget to comment down below with all your memories about these Standerwick Bristol VRLs. Did you travel on them? Did you even drive one? Have you driven one of the preserved ones? I'd love to know, I really would. And have you had your head under the bonnet on OCK 66K? Can you tell me what it looks like? If you did enjoy this video, please like and share it. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss my future releases in this and my other series here on YouTube. In future videos we will be continuing with the National Express story. We'll be taking a look at the MCW Metroliner coaches and much more. So don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on these wonderful bus videos, because you look like a bus enthusiast with very good taste. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all the new subscribers to the channel. Thank you very much for choosing to travel with us on our YouTube time machine. I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.